In this episode, we have a listen to and a look at the Skylight and Limelight microphones from 512 Audio. .512 Audio is a new company which makes, and I quote, professional gear built for creators. What this means to me is that it's less expensive than most professional gear, and it also probably means that it will make some sacrifices that pro-level mics probably wouldn't make. Both of these microphones are professional from the standpoint that they have XLR outputs, which means you'll need an audio interface for your computer to get those XLR inputs, or a field recorder with XLR inputs. However, these are both priced at $199 USD, so they're clearly aimed at people who want quality sound without spending substantially more money. So how do these two microphones sound without any magical post-processing? Here's some samples.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you're quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact.
It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. How do their grills and pop filters do at preventing plosives, that odd booming sound you sometimes hear when someone says the letter P or B directly into the microphone at close distance?
Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers.
Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers.
Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers.
Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Peter Piper picked a peck of purple pickled peppers. Those were pickled peppers, just in case anyone was wondering. Both of these microphones have directional polar patterns. The Skylight is a side address microphone with a cardioid polar pattern. That means that it picks up sound on the front, less on the sides, and very little sound on the back. The Limelight is a front address microphone with a supercardioid polar pattern. That means it picks up sound at the front, quite a bit less at the sides, and then some at the back. Also, sound coming from the back or sides will not only be picked up less than in the front, but it will often sound a little different. That's often referred to as coloration. Here are some samples on each of the microphones. Now here with the Skylight, I'm talking directly into the front of the microphone. We do have the pop shield on here. And this is what this sounds like talking directly into the front of the microphone. I'm now talking 90 degrees off axis, so into the side of the microphone. You can probably hear that some of the, or at least loudness-wise, it's reduced. And this is what it sounds like. The color may be a little bit different as well. Now I'm talking into the back of the microphone, so this should be the least sensitive part of the microphone in terms of its cardioid polar pattern, its directionality. And it's still going to pick up some of me, but probably not very much. Here we are talking back into the side of the microphone at 90 degrees off axis from the front. And now here I am talking into the front of the microphone. The Limelight's a little bit different in that it has what is called a hypercardioid polar pattern. Very sensitive on the front. That sensitivity falls off very quickly on the side, but then it picks up a little bit more on the back than it does on the sides. So this is what it sounds like on the front, and this is what it sounds like on the side. This should be rejecting a fair bit of what I'm saying here. Now I'm speaking into the back of the microphone so that you can hear what that sounds like. It's actually picking up a bit more on the back than it would on the sides. Here we are back at the sides with the polar pattern sample. And then here I am back at the front of the microphone. We're using incidentally 62, 63 dB of gain here. And this is what it sounds like on the Limelight. The Limelight is a dynamic broadcast-style microphone and produces a sound you might expect to hear from a radio DJ or podcast host. It creates a bassy sound. In fact, it's so bassy that it can pick up nearly every keystroke on the keyboard, every desk vibration, and every bump of the microphone stand. Now we're recording on the Limelight. I'm recording this into my Sound Devices MixPre 3. I have the gain set to 61 dB on the MixPre. And let's go ahead and type away here so you can hear what this sounds like. Typing on my Apple keyboard. On the same desk, of course. Now I'm using my Apple Magic Mouse. Now I'm tapping or bumping the desk and the microphone stand. And the microphone. Now I will turn on the high pass filter on the Sound Devices Mix Pre to 80 Hz. Now the high pass filter or low cut filter on the Mix Pre, same thing, different names, is set to 80 Hz. So anything below 80 Hz, it'll just roll that off. Here's what it sounds like on the keyboard. And then bumping the desk and the mic stand. Here's the Apple Magic Mouse. Here we're recording with the Skylight. I'm recording into a Sound Devices Mix Pre 3 recorder, and I have this mounted on a desk stand. No sort of additional shock mounting aside from what comes with a Skylight. Here I am typing on my Apple keyboard. Of course, the keyboard is on the same desk. Now I'm using my Magic Mouse. Now I'm going to bump the desk and the stand for the microphone. The filter seems to take away most of the bumps and vibration sounds, but makes the voice sound substantially thinner. I like to use a gentler low-cut filter on my recorder so that I retain most of the bass but remove a lot of the rumbling sounds picked up with the desk vibrations. This is what the microphone sounds like without the high-pass or the low-cut filter turned on here. That's two different names for the same thing. It's just cutting out some of the bass frequencies. That is going to handle rumble and things like that. So for example, when I touch this microphone stand, watch what happens. Or the microphone body. Wow. So that's how it sounds without the low-cut filter turned on the Limelight itself. I do have a 50 Hz low-cut filter turned on my recorder. In this case, is Sound Devices 888. I just bumped the stand there. I don't know if you heard that. You probably did. Now I have the low-cut filter on the Sound Devices 888 turned up to 80 Hz. So it's moving up a little bit to slightly higher frequencies. And this is what it sounds like. What we're trying to assess here is how much of the bass in my voice is it cutting out. It's not going to affect women's voices nearly as much, but for men's voices, you'll definitely start to hear a difference, especially with the low-cut filter turned on the 512 audio Limelight. Let's see how this does now in terms of bumping the stand. Still very much there. Now in this case, I have turned off the low-cut filter on my recorder, and I have turned on the low-cut filter here on the Limelight. You can hear it's actually affecting my voice a little bit. It's removing some of the lower frequencies, so it doesn't sound quite as rich. That's one of the kind of costs of doing this, but it should do a little bit better in terms of how much of the microphone stand tapping you'll hear. So it's a bit of a trade-off. I would normally probably just turn the low-cut filter off on the Limelight and turn it on my recorder where I can set it, and in that case I'd probably go to about 80 Hz. Self-noise is the hissing noise that's generated by electronic circuits in microphones, but both the Skylight and Limelight generate very little self-noise. In our practical noise floor tests, I record some dialogue as well as some silence in the same clip. I then loudness normalize the audio to minus 23 LUFS and measure the, quote, silent portion, which is a combination of any ambient sound in the room plus the self-noise of the microphone and the audio recorder. The Skylight came in at minus 68 dB RMS, and the Limelight came in at minus 74 dB RMS max. Anything lower than minus 60 dB RMS max is generally good, so these are both clean microphones. The Skylight is a condenser microphone, and it needs 48 volts phantom power. Almost every USB audio interface and field recorder can supply this. It also comes with a shock mount, so it's less likely to pick up much of the sound from you typing on your keyboard, tapping on the desk, or bumping the microphone stand. It also comes with an external pop filter and is less likely to pick up as many plosives. The Skylight has a sort of vintage sound to it. What I think the microphone would be well suited for is singing vocals, where you really need the singing to fit into a larger mix with a bunch of instruments. You would generally have to EQ singing vocals to fit anyway, and it would probably be less effort with a Skylight. I often think of this type of sound as mid-forward and somewhat old-school vintage sounding. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, well, that's why I'm providing these microphone sample clips. My assessment is that these two microphones sound good and perform well for their price. However, there are some things to take into consideration. The Limelight sounds quite good with a dark, bassy broadcast style of sound. However, there are 3 things you need to know. First, the microphone needs a lot of gain, ideally around 60 to 65 dB of clean gain. Many lower-priced audio interfaces for computers and field recorders cannot supply that much clean gain. So if you're working with a Focusrite Scarlett or a Zoom H4, H5, H6, or H8, you'll probably need an additional preamplifier like a cloud lifter or a FET head. Second, if you plan to use this microphone on your desk, I highly recommend you place a 3 centimeter or thicker piece of foam between the mic stand and your desk so that all of the bumps don't transfer to rumbling sounds in the mic. And third, this microphone is somewhat prone to plosives if you're very close, so you'll want to add an aftermarket foam cover or move it off to one side at a 45-degree angle to your mouth to reduce those plosives, like I've done here. The Skylight is a good-sounding microphone. I quite like it, though it isn't a fit for every voice. It has a vintage, mid-forward type of sound, which often works well for singing vocals. It sounds much brighter and more natural than the Limelight, in my opinion. I prefer its sound on Danny's voice over my voice. You'll also want to be careful about plosives with the Skylight. You can manage this by placing the microphone just off to the side of your mouth with it aimed at a 45-degree angle toward your mouth. My recommendation, if you want to upgrade the sound of your videos, these 2 microphones can be good options if you account for the nuances we've outlined. The Limelight is a better fit if you want that dark, bassy broadcast sound and your voice has plenty of sibilance and other high-frequency energy. This sounded better on my voice, at least to my ears. The Skylight is a good option if you prefer a brighter vintage sound and can position it close but a bit off to one side. This sounded much better on Danny's voice to my ears. So there's a look at 2 new, fairly affordable XLR microphones for podcasters, live streamers, YouTubers, musicians, or content creators. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that. And we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.